I would like to thank the presenters for staying on time. It's your time to ask questions. Maybe while you're formulating a question, I thought I'd make one observation about one of the talks and then ask a couple of questions I hope people respond to, and then we'll segue to the audience. I thought the information in Bob Sutter's presentation I found very interesting on a number of scores. One of which is the parallel of what's going on in China itself. It's actually having a very potentially large expansion of civil nuclear power, and that's becoming an issue in China. Just last week in China Daily, there was a whole page devoted to the debate and stopping a nuclear power materials manufacturing plant in the Pearl River Delta. But I've been, for the last 3 years, doing research on civil nuclear power development in China and interviewing, and it's quite clear that no one wants one of these things in their backyard if you're a civilian. Now the officials, they do. But what's interesting is in 2012, the National Development Commission in China passed a law. You can't put in any of these plants anymore without what was called, quite honestly, a stability risk assessment plan, like an environmental impact plan and so on. Now, of course, and if you got a medium level risk assessment, you could not proceed. Now, of course, local officials are local officials in China and don't always observe the regulations, but the point is that this same debate is going on in China, and also, I think in Taiwan, the whole issue of PRC nuclear power plants along the coast is this germane issue to them. So I just think this is an important issue, and it hasn't received what I think is the attention. I want to thank Bob in particular for bringing that to attention. My questions are just very simple, and I'd like anybody that feels they have something to say on it. Among the many dimensions of interaction across the strait are Chinese PRC students coming to Taiwan, and I wonder what we could say about that. Has that been? How would we evaluate that on both sides of the strait, as far as we can tell? And also, what's happening on cross-strait investment, foreign direct investment, particularly from the PRC, I'm most interested in, into Taiwan. Does anyone want to just sort of bring us up to date on those latter two topics? I guess not.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Probably people in the audience. I mean, these are factual questions.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The number of PRC students in Taiwan. Please help me out there if I'm, has been relatively low. They've been set there. There's sort of there's kind of a cap that's been set on it, and I can't remember what the figure is, but it's fairly low. There has been some. It's been somewhat controversial. The question of how many PRC students to allow into Taiwan. But President Ma has been trying to raise the number and to get consensus for raising the number. Similarly, PRC investment in Taiwan has also been quite low. There have been a lot of restrictions on which kind of industries they can be invested in. There's an approval process which has kept the amount quite low. I have recently read of some deals which, if they go through, would somewhat raise the figure significantly. I don't know. Bonnie, do you know?
I think Richard.
Yeah.
Just a couple of additional points. I think in the people-to-people side, the politically more significant interaction is mainland tourists,
Right.
which have been a boon to certain sectors in Taiwan, but and have impressed at least some PRC visitors with what a great place Taiwan is, but have also reminded folks on Taiwan that these are two different societies, just on a very day-to-day, street-level basis. And that's a reality, and we've seen that in Hong Kong too. It's not an overwhelming obstacle, but it does have political implications. Second, on investment, I have the impression that there is a certain amount of mainland money going into the Taiwan real estate market. And this has certain implications for young people in Taiwan who want to own real estate themselves because it means they can't necessarily live where they would like to live. And so there's an implication there too, but I think the big picture is that if restrictions can be lifted in some of the areas of direct investment, that could benefit Taiwan's economy.
Mike, there's one thing I'd add to this. As we know from the controversy over the Services Trade Agreement, on the one hand, the government is trying, in fact, to boost investment from the mainland. And there are sectors in the Taiwan economy who are saying, well, wait a minute, that's going to, gore my ox. And I think that's going to be true probably when we get to the merchandise trade agreement too. So, people get hurt in trade agreements, people get helped in trade agreements. And so it is controversial, and the trick for the government obviously is to make sure people see that the benefit outweighs the downside in a significant way, and that those who are hurt get adequate help.
And I would understand from prior debates that I've looked at in Taiwan, particular sensitivity in the banking financial sector to investments, and particularly the media sector in Taiwan. So, I mean, there may be a baseline of concerns, and, yeah.
Yeah, the media sector is already an issue, hot issue, yeah. And the sort of, there's also a sense that in the terms of media investment, that there can be indirect pressure. That Taiwan companies that have interests in the mainland maybe, receive whispered advice on what they should support or not support in Taiwan. So I mean, there are these, whether true or not, those are the stories that are in Taiwan.
I'm sure the reporters here wouldn't know anything about that.
Okay, it's your turn to ask questions. I'll try to alternate sides and front, back. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Wonderful event. And actually, I have a follow-up question about it.
Can I please ask people asking questions to identify themselves?
Sorry. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And I have a follow-up question about the service agreement between the two sides, because we know on September 15, Ma Ying-jeou and Su Zhenchang will have a debate on this agreement. So from the view of American, what do you expect from this debate? How do you see right now the debate in Taiwan about the service agreement? Because Richard, you mentioned that it's very important right now for the both sides to implement the agreement they have signed. So what's your view about that? Thank you.
Well, it's hard to speculate on this. You'll recall that a couple of years ago, after ECFA, there was a debate between President Ma and Tsai Ing-wen. And I think the general consensus was that President Ma won that debate, and that shaped the environment. So particularly because the Legislative Yuan will look at this agreement on an article-by-article basis, the broader political environment surrounding the agreement becomes very important. So it could be quite critical.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. Richard and Alan just mentioned a weakening of party and the government in Taiwan. It seems like a trend, even though in the future there may be a government change. I wonder, what do you see this will have an impact on the Taiwan and the U.S. relationship? And for Ray, I would like to ask, for the ICAO, what's the possible, action or measure that U.S. could take to support, since Bonnie mentioned this in her remarks a lot. And for the meeting between Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping, since, they both can talk about arms sale, is that possible that U.S. can, raise this question with the Chinese side to facilitate, a summit meeting between Taiwanese leaders and the Beijing? Thank you.
First observation I would make is that this phenomenon of, I guess what you'd call it is a fragmentation of the political system, is not just something that's going on in Taiwan. It's something we see in many open political systems around the world, even the United States. So it's not Taiwan specific. You asked about the potential impact on U.S.-Taiwan relations, and I can only speculate in a very general way, but that's to say that the place where this may have an impact, and I hope it doesn't have an impact, but it may, is in Taiwan's ability to actually ratify domestically and carry out agreements it reaches with the United States. And we've already had problems in that regard, and U.S. officials have raised doubts about the credibility of Taiwan's effectiveness as a trading partner. So I think this is something that it could have an impact. I hope it doesn't, but that's what comes to mind.
On the issue of what the U.S. Can do on the ICAO issue, I think Bonnie's really sort of covered that pretty well. I mean, of course, we've had conversations with other countries about this issue, and with the ICAO administration in Montreal. On the question of, I didn't quite understand the last question, the U.S. raising with the PRC the idea of a Ma and Xi Jinping meeting in order to talk about U.S. arms sales? Is that really what you were asking me?
That would be a Nobel Prize,
Yeah.
negotiation.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I just wonder, can U.S. facilitate like a summit between Beijing and Taipei's leaders?
That's probably would be a violation of one of the 6 assurances, but I don't know. I always liked what Winston Lord used to say, which was that Americans are not smart enough in order to facilitate negotiations between Chinese. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that remark. I don't, I think that's really not something that we would see that we would have a role in trying to do that.
Just on ICAO, I'd just like to ask a clarification of Bonnie, because I thought that was very interesting. Am I mistaken in my understanding that organization actually has, beyond the safety and issues that there are other practical issues like allocation of slots into major airports around the world and so forth, and also issues about the EU not long ago was going to put a carbon tax on airlines and so on, and so that there are really very practical economic issues at stake there too. Am I correct in understanding this, that there are lots of reasons way beyond politics Taiwan would want into this organization?
Yes, and I think that is an argument perhaps Taiwan could make more effectively for itself. But yes, it goes beyond air safety. I don't know about slots at airports. I don't think Taiwan has had any problem getting slots at airports, so there are other issues that are probably more pressing than that. But I did want to reiterate a point that, or maybe even elaborate on a point that both I made and Alan made, and that is that for what the United States can do, I believe really needs to be done quietly. Because the more we do publicly, the more I think, particularly at this sensitive juncture, where we are really down to the last few weeks before this meeting, this is putting Beijing in a position where, and particularly as Alan and I mentioned, the resolution in Congress that the president signed, and that the Chinese see this as putting them under pressure to make a concession that will then look weak in front of their people, that they're doing so not because they're working something out with Taiwan, but because, the U.S. has spoken out publicly, the Congress has said that Taiwan is to have a role in ICAO, and therefore, somehow Beijing has to respond. And so, I would argue that if other countries in the world, and particularly the United States, parliaments, et cetera, do not voice support for Taiwan, probably Beijing wouldn't feel that it's under too much pressure to do that. And that's why I say that Taiwan really has to strike a balance between getting support for the international community and also talking to Beijing. And in this regard, timing is very important. And so I think that what the United States has done so far has been useful. And at this point, if we do anything publicly in the next 4 weeks, my concern is we actually could make this prospect less likely. And others may disagree with me, but that's the way that I read it.
I think that's real good advice. Peter?
Thank you. I'm Peter Bertellier. I'm with Johns Hopkins SAIST, focusing on China's economy. I have a comment and a question. The comment concerns the question that Mike Lampton raised initially about the trade and investment relations across the strait. If I am allowed to supplement some of the comments that were already made, this the cross-strait trade has become by far the most important bilateral trade relationship for Taiwan. Well, that was not the case 15 years ago. Then their major trading partner was the US. Now, PRC is by far the largest trading partner of Taiwan. Secondly, on that same point, the economics, it seems to me that in the past 12 to 18 months, I don't really know the facts, an important breakthrough was achieved in terms of the currency agreement between Taiwan and the mainland. Both sides agreed to avoid the US dollar in settling trade accounts, but settle in each other currency. And that has been facilitated by the establishment of mainland banks in Taiwan, who now also accept renminbi deposits in Taiwan, which previously was totally impossible. So we have now, apart from Hong Kong, also a renminbi offshore market developing in Taiwan. It's still quite small, but I don't know if it will remain small. My question concerns another economic dimension of the relationship, and that's TPP. Bonnie mentioned in the context of her discussion on the regional comprehensive economic partnership discussions, very briefly TPP, nobody else mentioned it. My question is a factual one and one for comments. What exactly is Taiwan's role, if any, in the negotiations leading up to the TPP? When President Ma was here a few months ago, in his speeches explicitly stressed the importance of TPP for Taiwan. And if they are actually participating in the discussions on TPP, in what capacity? As a customs area, like WTO members, or as a state? If they are participating as a state, what does that mean for Beijing? Because we now hear rumblings from Beijing that they may also consider joining the discussions on TPP. Thank you.
Peter, my understanding is that, first of all, and most important, Taiwan is not within the group of countries in this round of TPP negotiations. And President Ma himself has said that TPP is an aspiration that will take a long time to realize. The group is closed with the arrival of Japan. Any consideration of Taiwan, bringing Taiwan into the group would occur in a second round or third round once the basic structure is already set. I would assume that Taiwan, if it wished to pursue this, would do this as a special customs territory, as it did for the WTO.
If I could just add something, at the risk of maybe disagreeing with Richard on just one point. Now, President Ma, I think, talks about TPP a little bit more realistically, maybe not in his term in office. At first he said Taiwan would join in 10 years, then he said within 8 years, and that was last year, so now it would be within 7 years. But more importantly, I think on the recent trip, and Alan was with me on the delegation, along with several others, my own conclusion is that I heard on this trip much more real sort of recognition of the need for Taiwan to liberalize its economy than I have heard in the past. There's a sense of momentum building with the signing of the agreement with New Zealand, the pending agreement with Singapore, the fact that, again, these are both TPP founding members. there is a recognition that Taiwan is going to pay a huge price if it continues to be marginalized from the regional economic integration process. This is one of the reasons I think Wu Boxiong raised RCEP with Xi Jinping. They want to join RCEP, they want to join TPP. And I was also pleased to hear when we talked with DPP members that they were very supportive of this process. Now, what it means, devil is always in the details. But people are saying, industries are going to be hurt. There's going to be winners. There's going to be losers. This has to be addressed in the right way. But this is the direction that Taiwan has to go. And so I sense greater seriousness about preparing Taiwan to join TPP than I've heard on my prior trips to Taiwan.
We don't disagree at all, and I think President Ma laid the intellectual foundation for this in his inaugural address last year, and specified the logic of why this is not just a nice idea, but a necessity. The question is, the ones you related to, or the ones you pointed to, is, what are the domestic interests that are going to be hurt by this? What can Taiwan do to compensate? Can Taiwan negotiate in a credible way?
Those are all excellent points. I would just add that recently I've heard Taiwan officials, both privately and publicly, sort of make a point that New Zealand and Singapore were chosen for a number of reasons as sort of the first partners for bilateral agreements, but one of the factors was that they are already TPP negotiating partners. And so therefore it was part of the process of preparing Taiwan and preparing it to make the kind of concessions that would be necessary to liberalize and be a credible TPP partner.
Thank you. You've been patient.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Have a question for Chairman Burghardt. Also have another one for Bonnie and other panelists. The first question for Ambassador Burghardt. Does the United States government have a position on the service trade agreement across the Taiwan Straits, or do you prefer to wait for President Ma to win or lose his debate with Chairman Su to make the statement? For Bonnie and other panelists, given Taiwan's tireless efforts and the U.S. Public and quiet support on the ICAO issue, how likely is Taiwan, in your estimate, able to become some sort of an observer at the this year's conference in Montreal? Thank you very much.
I know we haven't made a habit of taking a position on every agreement that Taiwan and the mainland sign. I mean, we've said that the overall pattern of reaching these agreements helps to increase cross-strait stability. We've also made the point that it's good for U.S. businesses. The reduction of protectionist measures by each side of the strait against the other opens up possibilities for American businesses located on one side of the strait or the other to also operate in the other market. So, and we've already seen many very interesting examples of that. So I would think from both a commercial point of view, as well as from a general interest in cross-strait stability, that we would see this as a positive development. But it's not something which we, that's a generalized reaction, not based on some detailed analysis of the agreement by lawyers in USTR. Okay, so yeah.
So just to add to the points that I made earlier on this issue, I would say again, I mean, if Taiwan were to refuse to talk with the mainland, I think that progress will not be made. I think that's not likely. I think there will be some conversations. So I don't think that will be the deal breaker. If the PRC seeks to actually use this as leverage to get something from President Ma, then that will raise a question as to whether they will set the bar too high, whether they will ask something that President Ma is not willing to give. And I personally think that it is not a good strategy for Beijing to link this with other issues. But I sense that there is that thinking, at least, that exists on the mainland, that this is sort of something they can use to pressure President Ma to give something. My just sort of gut feeling is that Taiwan won't get everything it wants, but it also won't get nothing. I think gaining observership in the assembly is quite difficult, and I think that since Beijing does really view that as political, that may be a bridge too far. But perhaps observership in the council or participation in meetings, specific expert meetings that deal with issues that relate to Taiwan's well-being, the well-being of its citizens. I think that it is unlikely that we will see no positive momentum, because I think that Beijing recognizes that that would be harmful to cross-strait relations and to its longer-term goal of winning hearts and minds in Taiwan.
Yes.
Doug Spellman from the Wilson Center. Arms sales continues to be the real gorilla in the room, it seems to me, as far as difficult issues in U.S.-China relations. Does anyone, this accumulated wisdom, let me first say this has been a terrific set of talks in my view. And there's lots of wisdom on this issue. Does anyone have any realistic idea of how this issue might be addressed and therefore ameliorated somewhat as a potential flashpoint in U.S.-China relations? We've heard over the years this one perhaps curious suggestion that there might be a deal between China reducing its defensive capabilities or offensive capabilities against Taiwan on the one side, and Taiwan, U.S. reducing its arms sales to Taiwan on the other side. Is this realistic? Is there any chance that something like this might work? If not, what else might work? I'm rather pessimistic, to be honest. On the Beijing side, I don't see them ever buying our argument that this actually improves stability rather than riles the situation. And on the other hand, I don't see much chance on our side of a reduction in the determination to continue to provide for the defense of Taiwan as the Taiwan Relations Act mandates that we do. Does anyone have any hopeful thoughts? Thank you.
Everybody
Everybody
does.
wants to comment on this one.
Go ahead.
You know, Americans inherently like to think that every question has an answer and every problem has a solution. But I remember when I was in Vietnam during the war, the French always told us how wrong we were to think that way. And their Cartesian view of the world was a bit more cynical. You know, there are differences between countries in international affairs that simply do not have ways that they can be breached. There cannot, you know, agreement cannot be reached. There are just fundamental policy differences between countries, and you just learn to work with those differences. And we've actually done a very good job of that with China since 1972 on precisely this issue. And so we've seen, you know, sort of constant efforts by China to encourage the United States to engage in a negotiation about, you know, or talks, or the latest version was a working group about how to implement the 82 communique. But we have also always, every administration has made clear that that is not something we're interested in doing. And so I would say, you know, this is something that the lack of ability to resolve this difference between us is not something that we should worry about too much.
I think there are a couple of things to suggest. First of all, the PRC, as I've heard it, is more realistically, in their view, seeking a reduction in sales, not a cutoff in sales at this point. And they tell us that that's, they're being reasonable. So I think that's one point to make. Second, it's quite clear that their reaction depends on what's sold. And we saw that in the difference in the reaction, and I think this is a decision that has been made. I think this reflects some consideration within Beijing about how to handle this issue. What was it, September 11 that the last package was sold, I believe, and the reaction was really quite minimal. You know, the Army band didn't go, which to some people is very important, but on the larger scheme, in the larger scheme of things, is not. And it has gone since, in my understanding. And there were a couple of exercises, humanitarian rescue exercises that were postponed, and so on and so forth. So it depends on what's being sold. I can't predict. Ray may be in a better position than anybody else on this panel to predict whether more sensitive issues will likely be sold. I would be very confident there will be another arms sales package during the Barack Obama administration, but I don't know what it would be, so I can't comment on that. Basically, to me, there are two ways to approach the solution, and I think Ray's points are very well taken. One is for Beijing to convince Taiwan that it doesn't represent a threat, and so Taipei doesn't need to buy these various weapon systems or seek to buy these weapon systems, so the U.S. won't sell them. But frankly, I think that Beijing's concern is much more about U.S. sales than about Taiwan purchases, because it is a manifestation, in their view, of U.S., if you will, hostile intentions, or at least not totally friendly intentions towards Taiwan. And so, although I think that we have convinced them through U.S. behavior during the Chen Shui-bian administration that the U.S. does not support movement toward Taiwan independence, as I said in my remarks, I don't think we've convinced them that we would support movement, if the two sides were to agree to it even, towards unification or anything of that sort, or that, in fact, we aren't even trying to keep them apart. And so that's a very long-term enterprise for the U.S. to try working with China to build some kind of confidence about what we really are all about in terms of our Taiwan policy. So I think that we're not going to, I think we maybe can convince them that we're not doing something that is actively pushing Taiwan in a wrong direction, but I think the basic strategic suspicion, if I may call it that, remains, and it's, as I say, a long-term enterprise.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
As I said, we all have something to say on this. It was reported that Xi Jinping proposed to President Obama that if the United States stops selling arms to Taiwan, that China will consider readjusting its military deployments. This, if true, sounds to me like it is exactly the same proposal that was made by Jiang Zemin to President George Bush in 2002. The situation in terms of U.S. interests really hasn't changed. Perhaps the Chinese think that what has really changed is China's power and potential leverage on this issue, and maybe that's why they are tabling it. But as many people pointed out at the time, the threat to Taiwan is far more than just Chinese missiles. Chinese missiles being redeployed, they're rail mobile, they can be moved back any time. No one in Beijing has said anything about destroying them. And this is, once again, an effort to solve this, resolve what they see as a problem through dialogue and negotiations with the United States over the head of Taiwan, which no U.S. government is going to do. And so I must admit it makes me somewhat disappointed that Chinese continue to misunderstand, just not assess correctly how the United States thinks about this issue, that they would, in their preparations for Xi Jinping's discussions with the U.S. president, that they would once again trot out this proposal. At the time, as I understand it, the Bush administration said, we welcome very much that China's thinking about readjusting its military deployments, and this is an issue you should discuss with Taiwan. And I think that should be the same answer today. We are not going to decide that we're going to stop selling arms to Taiwan. I think the logic that Alan introduced is really the correct logic. If Beijing reduces its threat to Taiwan, if Taiwan wants to purchase fewer weapons, spend less on defense, that's Taiwan's decision. Until then, we stand ready to stick by our commitments under the TRA and sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. And one more thing I would say, in addition to what Alan said about Beijing caring about what's sold, the Chinese care about the way in which this take place, whether they're taken by surprise. The timing of the decision is also very critical to Beijing. And I hear Chinese say there is sort of a tacit understanding. I wonder whether people in the U.S. government would agree, but I think there's this sense in Beijing that we're not going to sell the most advanced weapons. We are going to let China know in advance. The timing of the announcement of these decisions will sort of be factored into the decision so that Beijing sort of won't be, embarrassed about it, and that the relationship can withstand this continuing for some time as long as those parameters are basically respected. And there's always a possibility that they won't be, and then we could end up with what I see as potentially a major setback, not just in the military relationship, but potentially in the diplomatic relationship. So not easy to solve. I won't do an advertisement for another organization, but apparently there is a report that some organization is putting out on how to resolve this issue, but I haven't read it yet. So when that comes out, we can revisit as to whether or not their recommendations are ones I personally agree with.
Yeah, I'm not trying to cut it off. I was going to make a comment, and then I'll.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say apropos of this particular point, that the point I found compelling is we really don't want to pay Beijing to do something that's in Beijing's interest. I mean, in a sense, we want them to increase confidence across the strait, and that's in both sides' interest. So there's no particular reason. And then I think if there was more confidence, maybe there'd be a need for fewer sales. So it all fits there.
First round of
Go ahead.
comments. I'd like to make a comment on this as well. And we haven't talked about the domestic politics of China policy in this meeting. And having lived through the turmoil of domestic politics on China policy over the past several decades, I'm really glad President Obama has been able to keep some sort of equilibrium in this situation. Remember last year, it was just 2012, people were talking about, very prominent people were talking about we're in a crisis in U.S.-China relations. The Republicans were saying very interesting things about China in their primary. If you listen carefully, they were saying outrageous things. It's amazing what they were saying. And the debate between Romney and Obama over China policy. This would be, if this kind of a proposal were moved forward, it would be a good test of that equilibrium, I think. In other words, we would see, well, how stable is this equilibrium that we have domestically in dealing with China? This is a very sensitive issue, and so I'm not, I guess I might say that maybe it's not worth it in that sense, because it might be a lot of trouble domestically.
If I could just make a couple of comments, and then Ray can correct us all. I think both Alan and Bonnie pointed to the importance of PRC perceptions of this issue for good or ill, and either they're skillful or not. I mean, to come back to the metaphor you started with, I would say it's not the gorilla in the relationship. It may be a chimpanzee, but it's a gorilla because they make it a gorilla. Second, Alan suggested, and I agree with him, that arms sales are just, in a way for Beijing, a symptom of something much larger. And that's a broad security commitment to Taiwan that goes beyond arms sales. And that's the real problem. I would also observe that if Beijing thinks that U.S. arms sales are the reason it can't fulfill its political objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's probably wrong. The reason it can't fulfill its objectives is the nature of the offer it's making and its total unpopularity on the island. The way in which U.S. arms sales could have an impact, of course, is that Taiwan would feel such a lack of confidence that it would feel it has to submit to PRC intimidation and just give up. That is not a solution that I think is in Beijing's interest, much less Taiwan's interest. Thanks. Now over to Ray.
Every comment was perfect, brilliant.
However.
But I'm just going to, listening to them, it occurred to me that each side defines the issue differently. Beijing defines the issue as U.S. interference in an internal matter by providing arms to a rebellious party. The United States, and this is the way we have responded when this issue comes up, we define the issue as Taiwan and its leaders seeing a need to maintain a deterrent capability and to negotiate with that deterrent capability in place. And we are responding to their requests. So those are two different, completely different definitions of the issue.
Well, thank you for the question. You've got a lot of response. This gentleman's been very patient.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. Yeah, I want to ask, have you read a report lately about, someone mentioned that Taiwan has 23 diplomatic allies, but some of the allies in the Caribbean want to establish ties, diplomatic ties with the PRC, obviously. I mean, the PRC has not, there is obviously some kind of a understanding of a moratorium of this fight, so PRC has not make a gesture. So have you read any sort of reflection in Taiwan about this goodwill in the mainland, from the mainland? Under, Doug's arms sales thing, it seems to me that, China, US, Russia have nuclear weapons, but, no one thinks anyone is going to actually use it. But for these missiles on the mainland, the only scenario that could be used is Taiwan declared independence. So would anyone think, we'll talk about threat, so would we think there will be such a scenario if Taiwan, doesn't declare independence? So would that be a threat? Thank you.
So just briefly, I think since very early in President Ma's tenure, there have been instances of some of its diplomatic allies having an interest in being recognized by the PRC. And I think there are some suggestions that the PRC has said that it would like to not rock the boat with Taiwan. You call this goodwill. I would call this serving Beijing's interests. Imagine the negative impact on Taiwan, on cross-strait relations, on the goal of peaceful development that Xi Jinping and before him Hu Jintao want to achieve in the cross-strait relationship if the mainland were to establish diplomatic ties and basically invalidate this diplomatic truce that it has been informally or tacitly agreeing to. So I guess you could call it goodwill. I would just say it's good common sense and good policy.
Alan, and this will be the last word before lunch.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether you were asking also about the question of whether there is a real threat. But I would have to say, well, I think the chance of hostilities across the strait is not high. If I were sitting in a position of responsibility in Taipei, I wouldn't just take that as a given. There is a large, and indeed in certain respects increasing, both in terms of modernization and certain numbers, force which sits there, which is in important part dedicated to Taiwan. And so it's fine. First of all, Beijing hasn't said it wouldn't use force except in case of a declaration of independence. You have these terms in the anti-secession law which may sort of, kind of, perhaps equate to that. But if you read, as I'm sure you have, the 3 conditions in Article 8 of the anti-secession law, they're very vague and open to interpretation given the political circumstances at any given time. So yes, I think if I were a military or security planner in Taiwan, absolutely, I would consider that in a military sense a threat. Do I think that the PRC is looming there ready to attack tomorrow if it just sees the opportunity? No, I don't think so. But that's not the way one has to look at this issue. One has to look at the capabilities and the possibility that indeed judgments will change over time, even if there is not a formal declaration of independence by Taiwan.
Let's go.
Okay, the last word.
Just following up on what Alan said, in the anti-secession law, Beijing completely reserves to itself the right to make a decision as to whether some of those conditions have been violated, including one that the vaguest of all, that there is simply lack of progress toward unification. And so nobody else in the world, including the 23 million people in Taiwan or other members of the United Nations or anyone else, would get to have a say in that. It's something that would strictly be decided by the Politburo in Beijing. And so if I was sitting in the presidential office in Taiwan, I'd want to hedge my bets. I'd want to have some deterrent capability.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you, and most of all, I want to thank the Foundation for its presentation of this program and all the other good works you do.